Hello again. Hey BookTube. Today I'll be doing a chat. I don't know if I want to call this a review or anything, but I recently finished a book that's taken me quite a while to read, and I wanted to talk about it, so that's what this is. And the book that was The Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. It's Thucydides' history. Um, and it was written in the late 14 or no 400s BC. So, in classical, what we call now called classical Greece, in the time of just after the Persian Wars, or not just after, but sometime after the Persian Wars, and around the time uh, Socrates was in Athens. So, yeah, four started in 431 BC, I believe, or around that time. And Thucydides basically writes this big fat history of the war because he himself was Athenian and he wanted to give an accurate report of what he believed happened in the war because he believed it was the most important war that had ever been waged in the entire world, which was actually a pretty big hot take for Thucydides to claim that, considering you have the Trojan War, which is already at this time part of Greek legend, and you also have the Persian War, which I previously mentioned, which is actually covered in Herodotus's history, and Herodotus covers that because you have the Persian king coming down um, the Greek lands to attack major Greek cities and to completely overtake it, and the Greeks were this small collection of city-states that weren't really unified until they were forced to fend off what they called the barbarians. So basically, anyone who wasn't Greek is considered a barbarian, and Thucydides talks like that as well. And they miraculously defeated them, which is which was actually within relatively living memory from when the Peloponnesian War actually began. Um, and I read this thinking, or I read this kind of knowing what was going to happen because I actually took a class in university, an undergraduate class on classical Greece, and Thucydides was not one of our required readings. Like we didn't have to read the whole thing. We only read like minor selections, like the most famous pieces in here, and I quite enjoyed that class. And going back to Thucydides brought back a lot of those memories because I remember poring over the map of Greece that they have, and then you have like the whole what was it called, the Aegean, I don't know, sea, that collection of that sea there, where you have like the Greek on one side, and then you have the Asian Minor on the other side. And I remember just going through that map and poring over the names, and it was good memories because I had a really good professor. And so going back to Thucydides, I wasn't really reading him to read the actual history of the Peloponnesian War, though that was fun in itself. I was going to Thucydides to see how he actually does history, because last summer I read Herodotus, and I quite enjoyed him, even though it took me a while to read him as well. But Herodotus was a lot of fun with his stories and how the authorial presence was so evident in Herodotus, where Herodotus was right there with you, telling you these stories. While with Thucydides, it's a very stark contrast because Herodotus or Thucydides, he's trying to give you actual actual history in chronological order. So he even puts it in like summer, winter, summer, winter, summer, winter, and that actually makes it quite easy for my edition because at the very top there, they actually mention what year it was based off of Thucydides when he mentions like summer, winter, summer, winter. So he goes in chronological order. And I want to see how he did history and what mattered to him as a historian, because this book is just the existence of it to me is actually quite remarkable. Because, this book was written 2,400 years ago, give or take. And yet here we have like 500 pages of ancient history that somehow survived all that, because we don't have any original copies of this. We just have copies that were probably written down in the Middle Ages, and maybe some lucky copies that are, before that. I don't know what the textual history of this book is, but I do know that it's remarkable that we have such a long text, especially so soon after Herodotus. But it's definitely worth it that it survived, because not only does he give us so many details that we would not know otherwise, but we also get to see the perspective of a contemporary of the events that are actually happening in here, because Thucydides participated in this war himself, so he's coming from that perspective, and he's Athenian, so he's coming from the Athenian perspective as well. And you can tell, what matters to him, and why he would choose to present things in the way he would, because from what I understand, for the longest time, Thucydides was taken basically at his word by historians throughout the ages. Like, he was praised as the ideal historian, especially when history as a complete discipline started to be like put into academia, or crystallized into academia, and because he was seen as this objective analyzer of facts. Though we no longer see Thucydides at all like that now, though we do admire him, because he definitely has given us one of the best works of history that have survived. We do have some histories of overlapping with this period, but and I can't say their names off the top of my head. I do know that Xenophon is one of them. He continues Herodotus, because one of the sad things about this book, if you go for this book for a history of the Peloponnesian War, you'll be disappointed that we don't even actually get the ending of the war. So he's building up and he's building up to the end of the war, and we don't actually ever get that in here, because he stops mid-sentence, I believe, like 7 years out from the end of the war. This war took forever. It was like 30 years. So, I mean, conceivably, he would have written another 100 pages of that history, but we don't get it. And there's a lot of debate about whether or not Thucydides ended up dying before he finished it, because we do have textual knowledge, that Thucydides knew about the ending of the war, because he actually includes some reflections on them earlier on. So this book is a really interesting book, and I wanted to read it for that reason. But what took me so long is that this book is actually, I hate to admit it, is kind of a slog at times, because he's not telling, folk stories, or he's not trying to be entertaining, I guess you could say, so much as he's trying to crystallize his own interpretation of what actually happened. So with Herodotus, he will chase down any old story that he finds entertaining, and he will include that in his narrative. Which is why his book is rather sloppy, in the sense that it takes him so long and so many digressions to actually go over, actually get to the war between the Persians and the Greeks near the end of his book. But Thucydides, he gives us just like, I didn't actually find a quote to represent that, but where he's like, so these people were on this island, and then they went to this island, and there was a revolt here, but then they stopped at this island, and they attacked this city, and it just kind of goes like that at times, where it can be rather slow, and sometimes for me, I was reading nothing each day or 15 pages each day, so there was large stretches of time where I was reading other things instead because Thucydides just did not pull my attention. And if I was tired or something and I just wasn't in the mood for that kind of writing, then I wouldn't go to Thucydides. And so, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend anyone, just anyone would go to Thucydides anyways, because I think you need to be in a specific, have to have specific interests. One, you'd have to be very interested in nonfiction or history writing to begin with, and two, I think you have to be interested in how history works or how early history works, because he's not citing his sources or anything like a modern historian would. And so you have to do a lot of reading in between the lines about why he would include certain things and why he would leave things out, because this Oxford edition comes with a ton of notes, like 100 and some pages of notes, which I only looked at occasionally because I made that mistake with when I was reading Herodotus. I would read like 5-10 pages of Herodotus, and then I would read the accompanying like 4 or 5 pages of notes that would come in the back. And I find that took a lot of the enjoyment out of reading Herodotus for me. So I did read the introduction because with a book like this, there's no spoilers or anything you need to worry about, especially since I could follow the action pretty well myself. But yeah, I do recommend Herodotus if you're interested in learning about old history, but I don't recommend him if you feel like reading, just if you're interested in reading classical works and you want to read the most influential ones. Maybe Thucydides would be interesting to you, but for the general reader, I wouldn't recommend him. I mean, I don't want to undermine Thucydides in the sense that he's always dull, because he's not. There are some sections in here that were really, really good, and he does have really interesting ideas. Like his attitude towards Pericles is really interesting to see how much Thucydides actually admires him. And then when Pericles dies relatively early on in the narrative of the war, he dies of the plague. Thucydides actually gives his own analysis of Pericles and how the whole reason why the Athenians ended up losing, spoiler, they ended up losing the Peloponnesian War, is because they did not follow Pericles' his mandates and his ideals, which are given in a couple of good speeches that Thucydides himself writes. And those are really interesting to see, because if you contrast that to one of the other famous pieces in here, which is the Melian dialogue, which is Melos, which is a little island, one of those many little islands in the that sea that Athens had a lot of control over, because they were the powers of the sea. Well, Sparta was the power of the land, in the sense that they had their different domains. And so the Athenian empire was largely dominated through their power of the sea. And this one island was I believe they were neutral. And Athens doesn't care. They just want to attack this place and take it over for themselves. And Thucydides has this really weird moment, or does a really weird thing, which he does not ever do again in his entire narrative. He has them have a dialogue, and it's not even between people. It's not between a representative of Athens or a representative of Melos. It's an actual debate between Athenians and Melians. And the debate is basically Athens saying, we are stronger than you, and we want to conquer you, and you can either give in, or we will completely destroy you, because we are stronger than you. And Melos tries to come up with a ton of tricky ways to argue their way out of that, and Athens replies with equally witty, I guess you could say, and like snappy comebacks that tear down the Melians any kind of chance or hope the Melians had of surviving, because Athens, basically the moral story of that dialogue is that Athens is stronger and might makes right, so we have the right to conquer you, which is a complete separation from the ideals that are put forward by Pericles earlier on in this book. So even though Thucydides is Athenian and he does have his bias in that perspective, he does include a lot of criticism of the Athenians themselves. And one more defense of Thucydides is he does there, despite being dry in some places, he also does have good actual accounts of battles. Like the ones that stick out to me are the second expedition to Sicily, which happened, was it 418, give or take, BC, and it, basically for, was it 2-3 years, Athens tries to conquer Sicily during peace but not peace with Sparta. They tried to come to an agreement with a peace, but they kept disputing over the terms. But during this, relative peace, Athens tries to increase their empire, which is something that Thucydides does not recommend. And he gives us exquisite detail. Like I believe it's the full books. There's only 8 books total in this in Thucydides' work, and it's books was it 6 and 7 that he devotes entirely to that 2 or 3 year period, and he gives a lot of detail, but it's actually quite interesting, and it also makes you wonder how he got that information, considering he makes it clear that at the end of the Sicily expedition, which ends in complete disaster for Athens, they have thousands upon thousands of warriors that end up slaughtered, and very few end up actually making it back to Athens. And it makes you wonder, because he gives like personal details of some of the commanders there, and like how these commanders were feeling and why they made certain decisions and whatnot. Like he gives us a lot of details about these people that ended up dying quite a long way away from Athens. So it makes you wonder where he got a lot of that from, some of that personal detail from. But anyways, enough rambling about Thucydides. I do want to end off this video with one more thing. Okay, I'm back because I had to go get another book. And that one other thing that I wanted to talk about was another edition of Thucydides that I strongly recommend. And it's this one, the landmark Thucydides. And this is an oversized edition, as you can see. This is a small one. I did not actually read this edition because for reasons that I'll give later on, but what this edition does is it's meant to be a complete introduction to Thucydides. Like, this includes the entire Thucydides, but it gives you everything that you need to know to actually encounter this work for the first time. And the most important part of that is that almost every like 10 pages or so, they give maps. So like, you see that just everywhere, maps everywhere. Yeah, maps and different pictures, black and white though, but still great to see. And they include notes and summaries of each part. And the timeline is always there in the margins. And not only that, but at the very end, you can see here, there's a whole list of appendices that are just like 5 pages each, detailing one specific aspect of Thucydides, and like say the ships that they used in Thucydides, or how Thucydides deals with finance or calendars in the dating system. Let's see, there's more. The government, the Athenian government, so you get a little bit of an idea of how the government worked, because a lot of the stuff that's in these appendices would have been taken for granted by Thucydides as just being something that his audience would have already known. And so he doesn't talk about that at all. So you're left to put together through the bits and pieces that Thucydides does include as to how Athenian government works, how Spartan government works, how how their shipping worked, or how they fought in battles, that kind of thing. So this book really gives you everything that you need to know for that. But there is one downfall of this edition as well, and it's because this edition uses the very old Victorian translation by Richard Crawley. It's a revised edition, but it's got that old Victorian English for Thucydides, and the reason why is because that's a public domain translation, so they didn't have to pay for another translation when they already had, a scholar writing the introduction and scholars writing those appendices and trying to put together all the maps and whatnot. So the costs became too much, and so they just reused an old translation, which may or may not be good to start off with when you want to read Thucydides, because it's not entirely clear. So for what I did is I read this Oxford edition of Thucydides, which is translated by Martin Hammond and has introductions and notes by P.J. Rhodes. And this translation came out in 2007. So it's a lot clearer, I found, than reading this translation. So I read this translation, but I followed along. As you can see, I have my bookmark still in there. I followed along in here just to look at the maps and the notes and whatnot, because well, mostly the maps, because the maps are so helpful. They will give you the same map many times, but they will give you the map altered specifically for that period in the text. So if your text will show you at, like, maybe there is some kind of conflict in the southeast of the Peloponnese, then they will give you that map, which you've seen the outline before, and it will give you the specific towns and locations that are referenced in that part of the text. And they do that very generously. There's probably probably at least over 100 maps. Yeah, many maps. Doesn't say how many maps, but yeah, I strongly recommend this if you want to read Thucydides. And so I'll leave it at that. I don't know if I made any sense during that video, if I convinced you to read Thucydides, or if I put you off Thucydides. That's totally up to you. You can choose to maybe sample it, read a sample on Amazon. I believe on Amazon you can read a Kindle sample and see what you think of the beginning of Thucydides. If you really want to give it a try, or go to your library, take out a few translations and give him a try there. But what I'm trying to say is that he's not a must-read, like, say, someone super influential, like, I don't know, like Plato, if you really want to read classic literature, because this is a long commitment, and it took me a while to read him. Maybe you will enjoy it, but that's up to you. Anyways, that's enough of me talking, and I'll see you later.